If you're interested in hearing history from perspectives rarely told, please consider subscribing. These stories require deep research into primary sources, war diaries, and personal testimonies to bring you the unfiltered human experience of war from all sides. The following account has been reconstructed from Luftwaffe combat reports, U.S. Air Force debriefings, and post-war interviews with Franz Stigler and Charlie Brown. What follows is not myth or legend, but the true memory of two men whose brief encounter in the skies of Europe revealed humanity even in the midst of total war. The winter sun of December 20, 1943 was cold and pale over the fields of northern Germany. From an airfield in England, a formation of American B-17 flying fortresses droned into the sky. Their target, Bremen, a hub of factories that fed Hitler's war machine. Among them was one bomber, call sign Ye Olde Pub, commanded by a 21-year-old West Virginia farm boy named Charlie Brown. It was his very first mission as pilot in command. He sat at the controls with nervous hands, his eyes fixed on the endless horizon, the hum of 4 engines filling his ears. The men around him were scarcely older, 10 souls crammed into the steel belly of the flying fortress, each trusting the others with their lives. They had trained, joked, smoked, sung songs to drown the fear. But now, over enemy territory, fear pressed hard against their hearts. The Luftwaffe waited. As the formation neared Bremen, black puffs of flak bloomed in the sky. German anti-aircraft guns thundered from the ground. Shrapnel tore into wings, engines, fuselages. One bomber after another took hits, engines trailing smoke, some spiraling toward Earth in fiery death. Ye Olde Pub was hit too. Shells shredded the nose, destroyed the oxygen system, and smashed the cockpit glass. Brown was slammed against his seat, blood running down his face. One engine sputtered, another coughed black smoke. The bomber shuddered like a wounded beast. Then came the fighters. Messerschmitt, Bf-109s, and Focke-Wulfs slashed through the formation. Machine guns blazed. Cannon shells thudded. Brown's crew fought back with their 50-caliber guns, tracers streaking through the sky. But they were overwhelmed. Gunners were killed at their stations. The tail was ripped apart. Holes opened wide in the fuselage, freezing air blasting through. The bomber staggered, dropping out of formation, alone. Easy prey. Charlie Brown gripped the controls. Somehow, against all odds, he kept the plane flying. His crew, bloody and broken, looked to him with hollow eyes. They were far from home, deep over Germany, their aircraft mortally wounded. Not far away, a Luftwaffe pilot named Franz Stigler sat in the cockpit of his Messerschmitt Bf-109. He was no boy. He was a veteran ace, hardened by years of combat, credited with dozens of kills. On that day, he had scrambled to intercept the American bombers. His comrades had already torn into them, sending some to their graves. He scanned the sky, hunting for stragglers, and then he saw it. A crippled B-17, barely staying aloft, its tail shredded, its gunners silent. Smoke trailed behind it, holes gaping through its body. It was, by all rights, finished. Stigler closed in. His finger rested on the trigger. One squeeze and he would claim another victory, another kill mark for his scoreboard. But then, he looked closer. Through the broken fuselage, Stigler saw faces. Bloodied men slumped at their posts, one tending to another with a rag soaked in red. The tail gunner was dead. The plane's guns hung limp, silent. This was no fighting machine now. It was a coffin in the sky. He hesitated. His training, his orders, his duty as a Luftwaffe fighter, all told him to finish it. No mercy. The enemy must be destroyed. But something deeper spoke louder. He remembered his old commanding officer who had once told him, "If I ever see you shoot a man in a parachute, I'll shoot you myself. Honor is everything." Fight with honor, not murder. To kill these men would not be combat. It would be execution. Stigler pulled his Messerschmitt alongside the broken bomber. Inside, Charlie Brown and his crew tensed. They had no guns left to fire, no hope of fighting back. This was the end. But instead of firing, the German pilot looked at them, and saluted. Brown stared in disbelief. The man who should have killed him was flying wingtip to wingtip, his hand raised in respect. Then, astonishingly, Stigler began to gesture. He pointed toward Sweden, neutral territory where the bomber could land and the crew be interned safely. But Brown, dazed, confused, and determined to reach England, shook his head. So Stigler did something no one could have imagined. He stayed with them. Like a guardian, the German ace escorted the crippled B-17 across the skies of Germany. He kept his fighter close so German flak batteries would not fire, believing it was one of their own. For mile after mile he shielded them, risking his life and his career. At the edge of the sea, he looked again into the eyes of Charlie Brown. The two men, enemies by every definition, shared a moment of silent understanding. Then Stigler saluted once more and peeled away. Against all odds, Ye Old Pub made it back to England. It landed in ruins, holes big enough to crawl through, engines dead, crew barely alive. Charlie Brown staggered out, still stunned. When he told the debriefing officers about the German who had spared them, they ordered him never to speak of it. Such stories, they said, might humanize the enemy. It could not be allowed. For decades, he kept the secret. Far away, Franz Stigler returned to his base, silent about what he had done. If the Luftwaffe had learned the truth, he would have faced court-martial, perhaps even a firing squad. But in his heart, he knew. He had done the right thing. In that frozen sky over Germany, honor had outweighed orders, and two men, enemies in war, had shared a bond of humanity that neither would ever forget. To understand why Franz Stigler spared Charlie Brown and his crew on that bitter December day in 1943, we must return to his beginnings. Franz Stigler was not raised in hatred, nor molded by the ideology that poisoned much of Germany. He was born in Bavaria in 1915, into a family of aviators and craftsmen. His father was a pilot in the First World War, and from childhood Franz had looked to the skies. To him, flight was freedom, not destruction. As a boy, he loved model planes and spent hours on airfields, watching machines lift into the heavens. The roar of engines filled him with awe, not fear. By the time he was a teenager, he was already soaring in gliders, mastering the art of riding the winds. When the Luftwaffe began to grow under Hitler, Stigler joined not out of fanaticism, but because it was the only way to pursue his passion. He wanted to fly. He wanted to test his skill among the clouds. But the reality of war would test more than his flying. It would test his soul. When the Second World War erupted, Franz Stigler found himself in the cockpit of a Messerschmitt Bf 109, one of the deadliest fighters of its age. Sleek, fast, armed with cannons and machine guns, it was the cutting edge of German aviation. At first, flying meant duels with enemy aircraft. In North Africa, over the Mediterranean, in the defense of German cities, he encountered British Spitfires, American P-38 Lightnings, and B-17 bombers. He fought bravely and well. His kills mounted. Each time an enemy plane went down, his tally grew, a mark of honor in the Luftwaffe. But Stigler knew there was more to combat than numbers. The Luftwaffe encouraged victory counts, rewarding aces with medals and prestige. Yet Stigler carried with him something older than medals, a code instilled by his first commanding officer. Gustav Rödel was a veteran of the skies, a man who understood the thin line between combat and murder. One evening, after a mission, he gathered his young pilots and told them words that Franz would never forget. "You are fighter pilots, not butchers. Honor is everything. If I ever see you kill a man in a parachute, I will shoot you myself. You fight with honor, or you do not fight at all." The lesson burned into Franz's mind. War was cruel, but it did not erase humanity. A true warrior fought his enemy face to face, plane to plane, giving him a chance, not slaughtering him helpless. From then on, Stigler carried that creed. He would kill in combat, yes. He would fight fiercely, yes. But he would not cross the line into dishonor. By 1943, Stigler was a seasoned ace with more than 24 victories. He had faced death countless times, seen friends go down in flames, and lost comrades to the grinding attrition of air combat. He had also seen the devastation wrought on German cities by Allied bombers. Hamburg, Cologne, Berlin. Cities reduced to rubble, civilians buried under ruins, fires lighting the night sky. Every mission hardened him. Yet even then he remembered Rodel's words. He remembered that an enemy pilot was still a man, with a family, with fears, with a beating heart. It was a rare perspective in a war where propaganda dehumanized the other side, painting Americans and British as monsters, and Germans as demons in Allied eyes. To understand Stigler's choice on December 20th, we must also understand the temptation he faced. By 1943, Germany was bleeding. The Luftwaffe was stretched thin, its pilots exhausted, its resources dwindling. The Americans, by contrast, grew stronger, sending wave after wave of bombers into the Reich. For a German pilot, every kill mattered. Every bomber destroyed was one less raining destruction on German soil. High Command offered rewards for those who shot down enough aircraft. Medals, leave, even promotions. On that December morning, had Stigler destroyed Charlie Brown's bomber, it would have counted as a victory toward his Knight's Cross, one of Germany's highest honors. It would have brought him glory in the eyes of his commanders, perhaps even in the propaganda reels. But honor, to Stigler, meant more than medals. Flying was not just about machinery or tactics. In the cockpit, thousands of feet above the earth, there was only one thing that truly mattered: the man inside. Stigler knew what it meant to sit alone in a fragile shell of aluminum, his life measured in seconds, his fate written in the hands of a stranger. He knew the terror of tracer rounds ripping past his canopy, the helplessness of a damaged engine sputtering, the sight of parachutes blooming against the sky as comrades bailed out. When he looked at Charlie Brown's B-17 that day, he did not see just another enemy aircraft. He saw men, broken, bleeding, dying men. He saw himself, reflected in their struggle. And in that reflection, he made his choice. To let the B-17 go was not just an act of mercy. It was an act of rebellion. The Luftwaffe demanded results. High Command, drunk on Nazi ideology, expected no mercy. To spare the enemy was treasonous. If word of what Franz had done reached the wrong ears, he could have faced court-martial, disgrace, even execution. But for him, honor outweighed orders. He had sworn to himself long before that he would never be a butcher. And that day, he proved it. The choice also revealed the split inside Franz Stigler. He was a man of two worlds. A professional fighter pilot, loyal to his comrades and duty, but also a man of conscience, unwilling to surrender his humanity. This conflict would follow him for the rest of the war. He would fight bravely, continue to fly, continue to defend his homeland. But he would always carry with him the memory of the bomber he did not shoot. The moment over Bremen was not just chance. It was the living embodiment of Rodel's lesson. By sparing Charlie Brown and his crew, Stigler had proven that even in the most brutal conflict in human history, honor still had a place. It was not weakness. It was strength of a different kind. The strength to resist hatred, to choose mercy when violence was easier, to remember that even enemies were still men. When Franz landed his Messerschmitt later that day, he told no one. His comrades assumed he had failed to catch the bomber. His commanders never asked questions. He simply filed away the memory, carrying it with him silently. For him, the act of mercy needed no witnesses, no applause, no medals. It was between him, his conscience, and the men he spared. And those men, bleeding, broken, but alive, would one day remember too. The B-17 Ye Old Pub was a wreck when Franz Stigler peeled away and saluted. Its fuselage looked as though a giant hand had torn chunks from it. The nose was shattered, plexiglass gone, cold December air whipping through. The tail was shredded, one gunner dead at his post, another gravely wounded. Hydraulic lines dripped fluid like blood. Black smoke trailed behind the bomber as its engines coughed and sputtered. Inside, the crew clung to life. They had been together for months, trained as a unit, brothers by necessity and trust. Now they were bound together by pain and willpower alone. Charlie Brown, his head bleeding from flying glass, sat rigid at the controls. Every muscle ached, every heartbeat hammered in his chest. Yet his hands gripped the yoke with a kind of desperate stubbornness. He would not let the plane go. Not yet. Behind him, chaos reigned. Sergeant Hugh Eckenrode, the tail gunner, was dead, his station torn apart by cannon fire. Sergeant Lloyd Jennings, the right waist gunner, bled heavily from his leg. Sergeant Sam Blackford, the ball turret gunner, was unconscious, his face pale. Sergeant Andy Andrews, the left waist gunner, kept firing until his ammunition was gone, then tended to his comrades with trembling hands. Others sat stunned, shocked, ears ringing from the blast of shells. The B-17 was designed to be rugged. The flying fortress, but even it had limits, and Old Pub had passed them. It was flying on sheer will and luck. Charlie Brown had been raised on a farm in West Virginia, far from the killing fields of Europe. At 21, he was still more boy than man. This was his first mission as pilot in command, his first taste of combat, and already his baptism was fire and blood. Every part of him wanted to give in, to let go, to let the bomber fall into the snow-covered fields below. But the faces of his crew haunted him. They trusted him. They needed him. If he quit, they would die. So he kept flying. The bomber staggered westward toward the North Sea. German flak gunners spotted it, but hesitated. Some believed the Messerschmitt escorting it meant it was one of theirs. Others simply didn't waste ammunition on a plane that seemed ready to crash anyway. Stigler's silent protection, unknown to Charlie and his men, had saved them for miles. When the German ace finally saluted and turned back, the crew realized they were still alive. The skies ahead stretched empty, but survival was far from certain. The engines groaned. Frost bit into the crew's wounds. The freezing wind whistled through jagged holes, stealing what little strength they had left. Oxygen masks no longer worked. At high altitude, men drifted in and out of consciousness, their vision dimming, their hands stiff with cold. Charlie fought the controls, keeping the nose level, whispering to himself, "Just a little farther, just a little farther." The moment the bomber cleared the German coast and the gray expanse of the North Sea opened below, a new terror struck. If the engines failed now, the B-17 would plunge into icy waters. Survival there would last minutes. The crew, groaning and coughing, checked what little equipment they had left. Life rafts were shredded, radios broken, parachutes riddled with holes. They had no choice but to stay inside their dying bird and pray it could hold together until England. Charlie glanced at his instruments. 2 engines barely functioned. Altitude was dropping slowly, the bomber too heavy to climb higher. But the nose still pointed west, and so he pressed on. Hours later, the English coastline appeared, a gray smear against the winter horizon. For the first time, the crew felt a spark of hope. They were battered, frozen, half dead, but alive. Charlie guided the bomber toward the first airfield he saw. He lowered the landing gear. One wheel came down, the other refused. With the plane wobbling, smoke trailing, sparks flying, Old Pub touched down in a screech of tortured metal. The aircraft groaned, skidded, and finally shuddered to a stop. Silence followed, broken only by the hiss of cooling engines and the ragged breathing of its crew. They had made it. When ground crews rushed to the bomber, they stopped in disbelief. There were holes big enough to crawl through. Entire sections of the fuselage were missing. Hydraulic fluid painted the floor. The tail was shredded almost to nothing. No one believed it had flown across Germany, let alone landed safely. Some called it a miracle. Charlie Brown and his men were pulled out, bleeding, frostbitten, half-conscious. Medics worked quickly. They were alive, but scarred forever by what they had endured. In the debriefing room, Charlie told his officers everything. The flak, the fighters, the wounds, and the German pilot who had spared them. The intelligence officers listened, then leaned in close. "Never speak of this again," they told him. "Do not tell the press. Do not tell other crews. If word spreads that German pilots show mercy, men will hesitate in combat. This war has no room for mercy. Charlie was stunned. The moment that had defined his survival, the act of humanity in the midst of horror, was to be buried in silence. So he obeyed. He locked the story away in his memory. For decades he would not speak of it publicly. For the men of Ye Old Pub, that mission was etched into their souls. They had seen death up close, felt its breath, and somehow returned. In hospitals, they healed slowly. In letters home, they struggled to explain what had happened. Some carried nightmares of falling through icy air, of comrades screaming, of engines burning. Yet they also carried something else: gratitude. They knew that their lives had hung not only on Charlie's determination, but on the decision of one German pilot who chose not to kill. The war would go on. Charlie Brown and his crew would fly again, risking death each mission. The skies of Europe remained a slaughterhouse where mercy was rare. But deep in their hearts, they remembered December 20th, 1943, the day they flew home in a coffin of steel, saved by the mercy of a man they should have called enemy. And though the world demanded silence, each of them knew the truth. They had survived not only because of luck, but because of honor. When Ye Old Pub rolled to a stop on its ruined wheels and Charlie Brown staggered out, medics rushed to the crew. They were carried to stretchers, their faces pale, their uniforms soaked in blood and frost. For ground crews, it was nothing short of a miracle that the bomber had not exploded mid-air. But in the quiet, clinical rooms of the intelligence office, the miracle became something darker. Charlie gave his report honestly. He described the flak over Bremen, the swarms of German fighters, the crewmen killed or wounded. He described the moment when the Bf-109 appeared, the fear that this was the end, and then the unbelievable. The German pilot, instead of firing, had looked into his eyes, saluted, and escorted him to safety. The officers did not smile. They did not congratulate him. Instead, they leaned across the desk, their eyes hard. "Forget it," one of them said. "This story never leaves this room." Charlie blinked. "But sir, Don't you understand?" The officer snapped. "If you tell anyone the Germans are showing mercy, our men might hesitate. We can't afford hesitation. The war depends on total destruction." Charlie felt the words hit like a hammer. The single act that had saved his life, that had saved his crew, was now forbidden. The war had no room for compassion, so he swallowed his truth. Among his crew, the story was whispered but not shared beyond their circle. They were soldiers. They obeyed orders. Some of them felt relief. Speaking of mercy in a war that demanded hatred might have marked them as weak. Others felt a quiet sorrow, a weight in their hearts they could never lay down. Charlie Brown returned to missions. He climbed back into B-17s, flew across the channel, faced flak and fighters again. Each time he tightened his jaw and remembered what he had seen that day. Each time he felt the contradiction between what he knew in his soul, that even the enemy could be human, and what his officers demanded him to believe, that the enemy was a monster. The silence became a prison. On the other side of the war, Franz Stigler also said nothing. When he landed his Messerschmitt that day, his comrades asked if he had scored another kill. He shook his head and said only that he had not caught up with the straggler. It was a lie, and he carried it like a stone in his chest. For Franz, telling the truth would have been dangerous. If his commanders learned he had deliberately spared an American bomber, they could have court-martialed him. The Luftwaffe was no longer the chivalrous force of the early war. By 1943, it was desperate, brutal, commanded by men who demanded blood, not honor. A pilot who showed mercy could be branded a traitor. So Franz, too, kept silent. His only witness was the winter sky over Bremen, and the memory of the men inside that wounded fortress. Both sides in the war demanded a simple story. The enemy was evil, nothing else. For the Germans, Allied bomber crews were terror flyers, murderers of women and children. Propaganda films showed German civilians digging through rubble after raids, pointing fingers skyward in rage. To spare such men would have been seen as weakness. For the Allies, the Luftwaffe was the sharp edge of Nazism, the iron fist of Hitler's war machine. German pilots were painted as soulless hunters. To admit that one had shown compassion would have contradicted the carefully constructed image. War thrived on absolutes. Gray areas were dangerous. Humanity in the enemy was dangerous. And so the story of December 20th, 1943 was buried beneath silence. The war did not stop for Franz or Charlie. For Brown, missions continued. Each time he strapped in knowing death could find him. He flew through flak storms, dodged Messerschmitts, watched comrades fall in fireballs. His crew changed as men were killed or too badly wounded to fly again. The war ground them down, mission by mission. For Franz, life became a blur of takeoffs and landings, fuel and bullets, loss after loss. By 1944, the Luftwaffe was crumbling. The Allies sent hundreds, then thousands of bombers. No matter how many German fighters attacked, the bombers kept coming, more than the Luftwaffe could ever destroy. His friends died around him. His homeland crumbled under waves of bombs. His belief in the war, in victory, in honor itself, was tested again and again, but he never forgot the American bomber. Silence did not erase the memory. It deepened it. For Charlie Brown, nights after missions were filled with thoughts of the German pilot. Who was he? Why had he spared them? Did he live through the war, or did he die in the flames like so many others? For Franz, each time he saw a crippled bomber or a burning plane, he thought of that day. He wondered if those men had families, if mercy could have been shown again. But the war rarely gave him a chance to choose. Most battles were over in seconds, too fast for decisions beyond kill or be killed. Yet in their silence, both men carried the same burden, a story too human for war. As the war ended in 1945, the silence stretched into peacetime. Charlie returned to America, became an officer, and later entered civilian life. He carried on with the world's business, but in quiet moments, the memory came back. Franz survived the collapse of Germany, the defeat, the ruin of his homeland. He eventually emigrated to Canada, leaving behind the wreckage of the Third Reich. He built a new life, far from the ruins of war, but he too carried the memory. The silence became part of their lives. Decades passed. The world moved on. The war faded into history books and black and white photos. But for Charlie Brown and Franz Stigler, the story of that one flight remained vivid, sharp as if it had happened yesterday. For almost 50 years, the world knew nothing. Two men, enemies in the sky, had shared a moment of mercy that defied the cruelty of their age, but neither could speak of it. It would take decades, and one man's determination to find answers, before silence finally gave way to truth. For Franz Stigler, December 20th, 1943, was just one day in a war that stretched endlessly on. The bomber he spared became part of his private memory, but the Luftwaffe demanded he keep flying, keep killing, keep throwing himself against the tide of Allied bombers pouring across the skies of Europe. By 1944, the war had turned against Germany. The victories of 1940 and 1941 were a fading echo. The Reich was shrinking, retreating, bleeding. In the east, the Red Army surged westward. In the west, American and British bombers darkened the skies in armadas too vast for the dwindling Luftwaffe to stop. Franz was still flying his Messerschmitt, still climbing into the cold sky day after day. But the nature of the war had changed. It was no longer a duel of knights. It was survival. In the early years of the war, a German ace could find himself fighting against a handful of enemy fighters, a small bomber formation, duels where skill and daring meant everything. By 1944, those days were gone. When Franz took off from his airfields in Germany, he looked up at hundreds of B-17s, B-24 Liberators, and swarms of P-51 Mustangs flying escort. The Americans came in numbers so vast it seemed the sky itself was falling. The Luftwaffe, once feared, was now outnumbered, outgunned, and outpaced. Every flight was a gamble. Few pilots expected to come back alive. For Stigler, the burden of his code of honor became heavier. When he saw a crippled bomber, he thought of the crew inside, the men fighting to live. But now choices were rarer. Allied fighters gave no mercy. P-51s dove and slashed, their guns tearing apart German planes before they could even close on the bombers. Bombers themselves bristled with guns. A dozen 50-caliber machine guns spitting fire in every direction. There was little room for hesitation. In the chaos, Franz had to fight with everything he had. And yet even then he carried Rodel's lesson. No shooting parachutes, no cruelty, no dishonor. He held to it, even as the world around him lost all sense of rules. The Luftwaffe bled its pilots dry. Franz watched men he had trained with, men he had laughed with, men who had flown wingtip to wingtip with him, vanish in fireballs. The attrition was relentless. In 1944 alone, Germany lost tens of thousands of airmen. Pilots barely out of flight school were thrown into combat against seasoned Americans and British, and they were cut down in days. For Franz, each loss was another stone on his heart. He buried friends in the airfields, saw their empty bunks at night. The Luftwaffe had once been a fraternity of men bound by skill and honor. Now, it was a graveyard in the making. By the summer of 1944, the Allies landed in Normandy. The Western Front was open. Bombers now struck targets daily, burning cities, smashing bridges, cutting rail lines. Franz flew missions over France, Germany, and later over the ruins of his homeland. But each time he strapped into his fighter, he knew his odds were worse. The Luftwaffe was no longer the hunter. It was the hunted. Fuel was scarce. Spare parts were rarer. Training for new pilots was shortened to weeks. The proud force that had once terrorized Europe was gasping its last breaths. Still, Franz flew. Still he fought. Still he carried the memory of the day he spared a bomber, even as around him the war descended into madness. At times, Franz came close to earning the Knight's Cross, Germany's highest honor for bravery and skill. He had the kills, the courage, the survival record. But one thing always kept him from it. The tally of December 20th, 1943, that bomber. Those 10 men would have given him another mark, another victory. If he had pressed the trigger, he might have secured the medal, the glory, the recognition. Instead, he had chosen honor. And in the cruel mathematics of war, honor did not count. By late 1944 and into 1945, the Reich was collapsing. Cities lay in ruins. Millions of refugees streamed west. The Red Army crushed all resistance. For the Luftwaffe, it was now suicide missions. Pilots were ordered to ram bombers if they ran out of ammunition. The code of chivalry was long gone. The last days of the Third Reich demanded only death. Franz obeyed orders where he must, but in his heart, the war was over. He fought only for the comrades beside him, for survival in the chaos. The memory of the B-17 still lived inside him. It reminded him that not all was hatred, that mercy had meaning even in fire. But the world around him was burning too fast to care. When the war finally ended in May 1945, Franz Stigler was one of the lucky ones. He had survived. Most of his comrades had not. The Luftwaffe had lost nearly all its pilots. The skies over Germany, once filled with Messerschmitts, now belonged entirely to the Allies. Franz returned to a country in ruins. The cities were ashes, the economy gone. The Reich, nothing more than a memory of madness. The honor he had carried, the code he had lived by, seemed useless in a world reduced to rubble. After the war, Franz faced choices. He could remain in Germany, among the ruins, under the shadow of defeat. Or he could leave. He chose to begin anew. Eventually, he emigrated to Canada, far from the ruins of his homeland. There, he built a new life, working as a businessman, leaving behind the uniforms, the medals, the memories of war. But one memory he did not leave behind: the B-17. The men he had spared, the salute in the winter sky. For years, Franz carried it in silence. He had no idea what had become of the bomber. He assumed, perhaps, that it had crashed later, that the men he spared had not survived. But in his heart, he hoped. He hoped they had made it. He hoped they had lived. And in America, Charlie Brown carried the same hope, that the German who spared them had lived too. They were two men on opposite sides of the world, bound by a single moment in the sky, each wondering if the other still breathed. By 1945, the war had ended in fire and ruin. For Charlie, it was medals and silence. For Franz, it was exile and rebuilding. But both men knew that something had happened on December 20th, 1943, that had transcended the war itself. Something worth remembering. Something worth finding again. The silence, however, would stretch on for decades more. When the war finally ended in 1945, Charles "Charlie" Brown returned home to West Virginia. He was only 23, but he carried the scars of a lifetime. His body bore the wounds of flak and frostbite, and his mind carried images he could never erase. Burning planes spiraling to earth, the screams of dying men over the intercom, the ghostly silence of his wrecked B-17 as he tried to coax it home. Back in America, there were parades, medals, and speeches. He was decorated for bravery. The United States Army Air Forces acknowledged his missions, his leadership, and the survival of his crew. On paper, he was a hero. But behind the ceremonies, Charlie struggled with the weight of memory. The war might have ended, but the skies never left him. At night, he dreamed of engines sputtering, of flak bursting in black clouds, of tracer fire cutting the darkness. He woke sweating, heart hammering, hearing again the groans of his crew. Most haunting of all was not the violence, but the moment of mercy. He replayed it endlessly in his mind. The Messerschmitt sliding up beside his bomber, the German pilot's calm face, the salute, the wingtip-to-wingtip escort. It defied every lesson the war had drilled into him. Why? Why had the Germans spared them? Why, when death had been a finger's twitch away, had life been chosen instead? The question burned inside him for years. Charlie wanted to tell the story, but his superiors had been clear in 1943. Silence. The official record of that mission was written in cold language. Damage sustained, casualties, route flown. Nowhere did it mention mercy. Whenever he hinted at it to fellow veterans, he was met with skepticism or dismissal. "You were concussed," some said. "You imagined it." Others warned him not to spread tales that might soften the memory of the enemy. So Charlie learned to keep it quiet. The world wanted heroes and villains, not complexity. But silence did not erase the memory. It only deepened it. After the war, Charlie continued to serve in the newly formed U.S. Air Force. He built a career in aviation and intelligence, flying missions during the Cold War, and training new generations of airmen. He was respected, disciplined, a man who had stared death in the face and survived. Yet in private, the weight remained. He never forgot the men of Ye Old Pub, some now buried, others living with lifelong wounds. He never forgot the German who had shown them mercy. As the decades passed, he often wondered, had that pilot survived? Did he know the Americans had lived? Or had he been killed in the chaos of 1945? When Charlie eventually retired from the Air Force, he settled into civilian life. He worked for the State Department, then later entered business. He raised a family, lived quietly, contributed to his community. To most who knew him, he was simply a kind, hard-working man, a former officer who had served his country with honor. But in quiet moments, he returned to December 20th, 1943. The image never faded. A saluting German ace in a Messerschmitt haunted his thoughts more than any enemy who had tried to kill him. The silence of that story became its own wound. Unlike physical scars, which could be explained, or medals which could be displayed, the story of mercy had nowhere to go. It lived only inside him, a secret he shared with no one but the ghosts of his crew. Sometimes, late at night, he thought of writing it down. But what words could capture it? How could he explain the paradox of being saved by the man sent to kill him? And what if no one believed him? As the decades passed, Charlie grew older, but the memory remained as sharp as ever. By the 1980s, nearly 40 years after the war, he realized that he could no longer carry it alone. He began to think seriously. Perhaps that German pilot had survived. Perhaps he lived quietly, like Charlie himself, haunted by the same memory. The thought would not let go. So Charlie decided to search. Charlie began by writing letters to veteran associations, Air Force publications, and historical groups. He described the encounter in detail: the crippled B-17, the Messerschmitt, the salute, the escort to safety. He asked the same question over and over. Does anyone know who this German pilot was? At first there was silence. Months passed with no reply. Then a trickle of responses came. Mostly veterans who remembered hearing rumors of mercy in the skies, but no names, no proof. Charlie pressed on. He contacted Luftwaffe veteran groups, reached out to historians, left his story in newsletters. He was relentless. The memory had lived with him too long. He needed to know. By the late 1980s, the world had changed. The Cold War was ending. Former enemies were speaking openly, sharing stories once hidden. Archives were opening. One day Charlie received a letter. A German fighter pilot had read his description and recognized the event. His name was Franz Stigler. As Charlie read the letter, his hands trembled. The details matched perfectly. Franz described the bomber, the faces inside, the salute, the long escort across Germany. The man was real. He had survived. He had carried the same silence. Charlie felt tears rise in his eyes. For decades he had wondered if he had imagined it. Now at last he knew. It had truly happened. Charlie Brown had carried the memory for almost half a century, a weight of silence and unanswered questions. Now finally the truth had surfaced. The German pilot who saluted his enemy lived still, and soon the two men would meet again. Not as enemies, but as brothers. By the late 1980s, Charlie Brown was no longer the young pilot who had fought to keep ye old pub in the air. He was in his 60s, gray-haired, a retired officer who had spent decades serving his country. But inside, he still carried the boy who had looked out of shattered glass in 1943 and seen a German pilot salute him instead of firing. His search for that man, the ghost in the Messerschmitt, had taken years. He had written letters, published notices in veteran magazines, spoken to historians, and finally, after all the silence, a letter had arrived. It was from a Luftwaffe veteran living in Canada. His name, Franz Stigler. Franz's letter was simple, but it carried the weight of a lifetime. He described the encounter exactly as Charlie remembered it. The crippled B-17 limping over Bremen, the dead tail gunner, the wounded crew, the silent salute, the escort across the German coast. When Charlie read it, he felt the decades melt away. Tears blurred his vision. The man was real. He had lived. At the same time in Canada, Franz sat with his own letter, finally able to speak openly about the moment that had haunted him for decades. For years he had carried the secret, afraid to tell anyone. Now to know that the Americans he spared had survived, that they remembered, was a gift he never thought he would receive. Not long after, Charlie picked up the phone. His fingers trembled as he dialed the number Franz had provided. The line crackled, then a deep, steady voice answered. "Franz Stigler?" Charlie asked. "Yes." "This is Charlie Brown. I think we met once, over Bremen, December 20th, 1943. There was a pause. Then laughter, warm and astonished, spilled down the line. "Yes," Franz said. "I remember you." The two men spoke for hours as though no time had passed. They compared memories, filling in details each had never known. Franz describing what he saw through the B-17's holes, Charlie describing the stunned silence of his crew. Both realized the same thing. That day had changed them forever. In 1990, nearly 50 years after that frozen day in the sky, Charlie Brown and Franz Stigler met face to face. The meeting took place in Florida, arranged quietly, with friends and family gathered. Cameras were not the point. It was about two men, finally able to look each other in the eye without gun sights between them. When Franz walked into the room, Charlie rose slowly. For a moment they simply stood, staring. One was German, the other American. One had once had his finger on the trigger. The other had been ready to die. Then, without hesitation, they embraced. Both men wept. Over the next days, Charlie and Franz sat for hours, telling their stories. They spoke not only of the mission, but of the lives they had led since. Charlie described the silence forced on him by U.S. officers, the disbelief of fellow veterans, the decades of wondering. Franz spoke of the danger he would have faced if his commanders had discovered his mercy, the comrades he had lost, the emptiness of post-war exile. For both men, the reunion was not just friendship. It was release. A wound long buried had finally been healed. As the years went on, Charlie and Franz grew closer. They called each other weekly. They visited often, traveling across countries just to spend time together. Their families embraced the bond. Charlie's children called Franz Uncle Franz, while Franz's loved ones welcomed Charlie as if he were blood. It was as though fate, which had once placed them as enemies, had now corrected itself. For Charlie, Franz became more than a friend. He was a brother, a man who had not only spared his life, but reminded him that humanity could survive even in the darkest war. For Franz, Charlie was the proof that his choice had been right. The men he spared had not vanished. They had lived full lives, families, careers, children. His mercy had rippled forward through generations. Often, when they sat together, Charlie would look at him and say softly, "I owe you everything." Franz would shake his head. "No," he'd reply, "we owe each other." That day changed both of us. As their story emerged, historians and journalists began to take notice. It was unlike any other tale of the war. Two enemies, locked in combat, choosing humanity instead of hatred, then finding each other decades later. They appeared at events, spoke to veterans groups, told their story not as propaganda but as testimony. Audiences listened in awe. Many wept. In a war remembered for cruelty, here was proof that mercy had not died. Their story spread, reminding people that even in the worst conflict in human history, there had been light. The two men often returned to the subject of that day in 1943. They would replay the events, filling in details the other could not see. Charlie asked Franz what he had thought when he first saw the bomber. Franz admitted that he had been tempted to fire. But then he saw their faces, the wounded, the helpless. That was when he remembered Rodel's words. "If I ever see you shoot a man in a parachute, I'll shoot you myself." Charlie listened, tears in his eyes. "You could have ended us, and no one would have blamed you." Franz shook his head. "It would not have been victory. It would have been murder. That is not why I flew." In the 1990s, the world finally learned of their encounter. Articles were written, books published. The tale of Franz Stigler and Charlie Brown spread across nations, across languages. For many, it was almost unbelievable. In a war that had claimed millions, here was a single act of mercy that defied the entire logic of destruction. For veterans on both sides, it was a reminder that war did not erase humanity. It only buried it, waiting for moments like this to break through. Nearly 50 years after the war, two men who should have been enemies sat together as brothers. They shared meals, told stories, laughed, and mourned. The salute that had once been a gesture of respect between foes had now become the foundation of a friendship deeper than blood. They had fought in a world that demanded hate, but they had chosen humanity, and for the rest of their lives, they would remind the world that mercy, too, can leave a legacy. After their reunion in 1990, Franz Stigler and Charlie Brown were no longer bound by silence. They had spent nearly half a century carrying the memory of a single day, hidden from the world. Now, at last, they were free to share it, and the world listened. At first, it was among small circles. Veterans' reunions, aviation clubs, schools where young people gathered to hear living history. Charlie and Franz sat side by side, telling their story. The German accented English, the American speaking, with West Virginian grit, both nodding and filling in each other's details. Then the story grew. Journalists wrote about it. Historians documented it. Documentaries captured their words. It spread far beyond the small gatherings, across nations, across languages, across generations. What stunned people most was not simply the mercy shown in 1943, but the friendship that followed. Franz and Charlie became inseparable. They phoned each other weekly, wrote letters, and traveled across the Atlantic to meet. Their families merged, calling one another uncle and aunt. Charlie once told his daughter, "Franz Stigler is not my friend. He is my brother." For Franz, it was the same. In Charlie, he saw not an American enemy, but a mirror of himself, a man who had survived the same war, carried the same scars, and chosen to live with honor. In later interviews, Franz admitted, "If I had shot them down that day, I would have had no peace after the war. I would have considered it murder. Charlie gave me peace by remembering." Together they spoke not just of their encounter but of the men who had not survived. Franz remembered comrades who had burned in their cockpits, boys barely out of training, school sent against waves of bombers they could not stop. Charlie remembered American crews who had not limped home, who had plunged into the sea or vanished into flames. When they stood together before audiences, they represented not just themselves but all the men who had fought. They reminded listeners that behind every aircraft number, behind every uniform, there had been human beings, and in doing so, they carried forward the memory of mercy, a reminder that even in the darkest times, humanity can break through. In the 1990s and early 2000s, both men received recognition not just from veterans, but from nations. Charlie was invited to speak at military academies, where young officers learned not just of strategy and bravery, but of conscience. Franz, long silent in Canada, was embraced by communities that once would have shunned a Luftwaffe pilot. Together they showed that reconciliation was not only possible, but powerful. One of the most emotional moments came when Franz visited reunions of the American 379th Bomb Group, the very men whose lives had been threatened by the Luftwaffe he once fought for. Instead of hostility, they greeted him with open arms. Many clasped his hand, some with tears in their eyes, saying, "It could have been me you spared that day." The act of December 20th, 1943, did not end with 10 men in a bomber, because Franz Stigler spared Charlie Brown and his crew. Families were created, children were born, grandchildren grew up, lives rippled outward like waves on water. At one reunion, a member of Charlie's crew pointed to his family and said, "All of this, my children, my grandchildren, exists because one German pilot chose not to pull the trigger." It was a legacy greater than medals or victories. It was life itself. In their twilight years, Charlie and Franz continued their friendship. They wrote, visited, laughed, and mourned together. They knew their time was limited, but they also knew they had been blessed with something extraordinary. When asked why their story mattered, Charlie often said, "We're proof that you can be enemies in war and brothers in peace." Franz, too, reflected on the lesson. War makes men do terrible things, but if you lose your honor, you lose yourself. That day, I chose not to lose mine. Charlie Brown passed away in 2008 at the age of 86. Franz Stigler followed only a few months later, also at 92. Some said it was fitting. Two men bound by a moment in the sky, their lives running parallel for decades, should leave the world almost together. At their funerals, families, veterans, and historians remembered them not for the planes they flew or the battles they fought, but for the humanity they shared. Today, the story of Charlie Brown and Franz Stigler is told in books, films, and classrooms. It has become one of the most famous stories of mercy in the Second World War. At the Bendler Block in Berlin, at the Air Force Academy in the United States, at schools across Canada, their names are spoken not as enemies, but as symbols of humanity. In a war remembered for destruction, their story shines like a small flame in the darkness. Fragile, but enduring. On December 20th, 1943, a German ace saluted his enemy and chose not to kill. 50 years later, that enemy became his brother. Their story reminds us that war is made by nations, but lived by men. And sometimes, Even in the midst of destruction, men can choose honor. It was one salute, one gesture, one act of mercy, but it changed everything.